Welcome to this episode of Outside Ourselves Summer Break. I am taking a break this summer from full-length interviews for this mini-series, and in each episode of Summer Break, we are going to be taking a look at a particular piece of art, film, or literature that has some theological implications or theological echoes of the gospel. If you've been listening to Outside Ourselves for a while, all of my guests should be familiar faces to you. And in today's episode, I have Amy Mantravadi, who is a 1517 contributor and also an author and novelist, back on the show to talk about one of her favorite novels, Jane Eyre. I think Amy makes a pretty compelling case that Charlotte Bronte had in mind a sort of law gospel interplay that runs throughout the entirety of her novel. And that's exactly what we go through today. Whether you have read Jane Eyre or not, I think that you'll be able to follow along with what Amy has to say. And I know that you're going to enjoy it. With that, here's our episode. Amy Mantravadi, welcome back to the show. You are, for those who don't know who you are a 1517 contributor, a historical fiction novelist. You've written 2 historical fiction books. One is out with 1517 Publishing, and the other is coming out this fall, which is super exciting. And I am going to just refer to you as like an internet theology whiz kid, which really by that I mean, and I don't think I mentioned this on the last time you were on the show, but you are on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, a lot. And you've put together these amazing threads that kind of trace something within Christian history, Reformation history, or even like a theological doctrine through the eyes of some like cultural figure or show. I think you've done a few threads that where you compare like Taylor Swift to the Reformation. Maybe you can tell me because I'm forgetting them all, but they're incredible. What are some of your favorites that you've done?
The first one I ever did was the Reformation told in Taylor Swift gifs. And
Okay.
I actually put that together the day my husband and I were visiting Wittenberg, Germany. I guess I had the Reformation on my brain.
Yeah.
And it all started, there was one particular lyric in a Taylor Swift song that made me think of something in the Reformation. Then I said, oh, maybe I could find other things. And I got a big response to it, which unfortunately encouraged me to keep it up because, really people should have been encouraging me in sanctification, but instead they gave me an extra dopamine hit. So I went through for about a year. I was doing the Reformation in Friends gifts was probably about the most popular I ever did. I did that on Reformation Day back in 2023. And
Okay.
Matthew Peary had just died, and so there was it was kind of everyone was talking about Friends, and so that was popular. And it was crazy because I would have people who were actually teaching church history at seminaries message me and say, I'm going to use this in class next semester. I'd be like, oh dear, I didn't I don't know
That's
if
amazing.
you should be using me as a source, but it was pretty funny.
They're so fun and such a good, I think, way to get people into theology and Christian history. And that's kind of what we're here today to talk about. These little mini episodes that I'm hoping to record for Outside Ourselves for the summer. I really want to give people that, like a touch point of theology within the arts that they maybe haven't thought about before. So we are here today to talk about the novel Jane Eyre. That is what you kind of brought to me as a good touch point in a work of art, a work of literature where theological themes show up. So with that, can you kind of give us I don't want to get too bogged down in the summary of the book. Hopefully people who are listening are at least somewhat familiar with the novel, or maybe a film adaptation of the novel. But can you give us kind of the elevator pitch for Jane Eyre? What is the book about? What's a little bit of the background?
Well, it's probably not shocking that when you asked me about this, Kelsi, I chose a novel of all things, given that
It's great. It's
I
great.
like to write them myself.
Yeah.
But yeah, what is Jane Eyre? Well, it is a book written by Charlotte Bronte in 19th century England, set in 19th century England. And you originally asked me if there was a film I wanted to discuss, and actually Jane Eyre has been made into a film so many times, maybe more than any other story. It's like got to be right at the top. So it was first made into a film in 1910, and in which way it was only an hour long because they really couldn't make things as long then. It was made in 1943 with Orson Welles and Joan Fontaine. But more recently, the one I would recommend for people to watch first is the 2006 BBC miniseries with Toby Stephens and Ruth Wilson. And then in 2011, they made one with Michael Fassbender and Mia Wasikowska, which hopefully I pronounced that correctly. So if anyone wants to watch it on film, that would be your go-to. But okay, so it starts with Jane Eyre. She's an orphan child who lives with relatives that are always mistreating her, and she despises them as a result. One day, a man named Mr. Brocklehurst arrives and explains that Jane is going to be moved to a school specifically for orphans. The school is run according to very strict puritanical principles, and I don't actually like using puritanical as an insult because the Puritans were a pretty broad, varied group. But
That's
for
true.
this guy, you need to think of it in the most negative sense of puritanical.
And
I really was
puritanical and pietistic maybe too, in the worst sense of that word as well. Yeah,
very legalistic.
Yes.
And the girls are treated harshly there, but Jane is able to make one friend named Helen Burns, who unfortunately then dies during an outbreak of typhus. So this is Victorian novels in England often start out with things going very badly, and that is the case here. Eventually we get rid of Mr. Brocklehurst, thank goodness. Jane's situation improves at the school. She becomes well educated. She moves to the home of a wealthy gentleman named Edward Rochester to serve as a governess to his young ward, which was common at the time. Charlotte Bronte herself actually served as a governess for a wealthy family. And Jane ends up becoming good friends with Mr. Rochester, even though they have this vast class difference. Mr. Rochester is in the upper class. He's a gentleman, part of the nobility. And he eventually asks her to marry him, and she accepts. However, plot twist, it's revealed on the day of their wedding that Mr. Rochester is already married. He has an insane wife who he secretly keeps in a portion of the house where she's cared for. This is usually referred to as the mad woman in the attic plot. Okay, This is the most famous case of a mad woman in the attic. Mr. Rochester then begs Jane to still live with him, not married. She refuses and flees the house. Some people find her wandering on the moor, which is a very Bronte sister kind of thing to have your characters do. She's wandering on the moor. She's in bad health. She has no money, nothing in her possession. She's taken in by Sinjin Rivers and his sisters. Now, this is a very odd name. It's spelled St. John, but it's pronounced Sinjin, which I have to believe even in 19th century England was an exceedingly odd name, but there we have it. So Sinjin is preparing to become a missionary to India. And while she's there, Jane learns that a long-lost uncle has died and left her a large sum of money, so she's now wealthy. And after some time, Sinjin asks Jane to accompany him to India as his wife and be a missionary with him, even though they definitely are not in love, do not love each other. Jane refuses, and she decides to return and seek out Mr. Rochester. And she discovers that his home has burned down after his wife, who was mentally ill, started a fire. And the wife, Mrs. Rochester, is now dead, and Mr. Rochester has been injured and blinded, attempting to rescue others from the fire. And the book ends with Jane reuniting with Mr. Rochester, and she's now an independent woman, but she chooses to stay and care for him, and they end up getting married. So That's a little long for an elevator pitch, but
It's fine. It worked
that's
great.
the basics
Yeah.
of the story.
There you go.
So, yeah, you would ask me, how do we see law and gospel in this story? And we could go on at length. A lot of people, this novel has been so analyzed by literary critics over the years. A lot of people see the main theme as being one of like passion versus dispassion, expressing your feelings versus keeping your feelings in. And they'll even look at the mad woman in the attic as a kind of a symbol or metaphor for what Jane is experiencing inside, these feelings that just want to break out and that are chaotic. And they say that woman has to die for her to become a proper Victorian wife. I don't know that this is actually the interpretation that Charlotte Bronte would have wanted us to take from the book, although, I mean, it could be in there. It's a long enough story. It's a very long book. There's a lot going on. But Charlotte Bronte was actually the daughter of an Anglican minister. And from all the evidence left in her letters and everything, she was very convinced of Anglican doctrine, of an Orthodox understanding of the Bible. Her Christian faith was very important to her. And we do know that within the Anglican tradition, while there's been variety over the centuries, there definitely is that understanding of the difference between law and gospel that's coming in from people like Martin Luther or even some Reformed theologians on the continent. That kind of understanding, whether they put it in exactly the same terms as Luther, is definitely there. So in the book, it goes through various stages of Jane's life. And we see in the opening stage of her life, when she's young, the law is represented by Mr. Brocklehurst, and the gospel is represented by Helen Burns. And in the later stage of her life, we see that the law is represented by Sinjin Rivers, and the gospel is represented by Mr. Rochester. Now, this does not mean that the law characters are perfect at following the law, or that the gospel characters always have a perfect understanding of biblical truth. Yeah. It means that through those characters, we see those concepts coming forward. And throughout the book, we're going to see Jane herself move from a law understanding to a gospel understanding in how she views and treats people. So with that in mind, I do have my very large volume all ready to go. We're going to go old school here with actual tabs and a paper book. So I'm going to start out by reading one of the most famous scenes from the book. It appears in all the film adaptations. And this is when Jane is a young girl and Mr. Brocklehurst comes to her aunt's house to inform her that she will be going away to the orphanage to live a puritanical existence. And so here's what he says. He says, "No sight so sad as that of a naughty child," he began, "especially a naughty little girl. Do you know where the wicked go after death?" "They go to hell," was my ready and orthodox answer. "And what is hell? Can you tell me that?" "A pit full of fire." "And should you like to fall into that pit, and to be burning there forever?" "No, sir." "What must you do to avoid it?" I deliberated a moment. My answer, when it did come, was objectionable. "I must keep in good health, sir, and not die." So, we're seeing there, first of all, that this guy is just hitting her with divine judgment. Okay, there's no mercy here. You better straighten up or you're going to hell. And Jane's response to this, as to all her objectionable relatives in her youth, is not really to respond with the gospel, but to respond with a sarcastic remark or to try to get back at them. She wants vengeance on them in her own little way. She hates them. She doesn't have a sense of grace toward them. Now, to be fair, they're showing no grace to her at all. Yeah. But she can only focus on her miseries and how bad everyone's being to her. And she has no concept, first of all, that, she might have some badness in herself. I mean, everyone's telling her she's bad, but her own moral compass is telling her, I'm a lot better than these people. Right. And so we're seeing that at that point in her life.
It's such a natural reaction to the law really coming down on you is and especially for a child, I think of even my own kids, who often, when I'm bringing the law down on them, right, hopefully rightfully so most of the time, the way that they often try to get out from under it is by being silly, or by because I think, as a child, you feel that condemnation, again, rightfully or wrongfully. I think in Jane's case, a lot of times it's wrong. It's not necessarily the right use of God's law, but your reaction is like, how do I've got to escape, like I need to get away from this. And so either this isn't true about me, like kind of what you're saying, this isn't actually in me, or I'm better than that, or like I'm gonna fight fire with fire, and I'm gonna do that through being silly and sarcastic, or by bringing my own vengeance and revenge.
Yeah. And she goes to the school, and this is definitely the attitude she continues to get. At one point, Mr. Brocklehurst has her stand on a stool, and everyone in the school call her a liar. And he makes her stand there for hours just getting shaved. And, this is just, it's sort of the most stereotypical version of the law we can see, right? That literally calling on not only God, but everyone in society to shame this person. It's like the scarlet letter understanding of the law.
Mm-hmm.
But when she's there, Jane does meet Helen Burns, who I mentioned is going to be our representative here of the gospel. And despite being very young, she's a little older than Jane. Helen somewhere has managed to pick up this much more grace-filled idea about life. So we're going to start out. This is Jane talking to Helen. She says, I feel this, Helen. I must dislike those who, whatever I do to please them, persist in disliking me. I must resist those who punish me unjustly. It is as natural as that I should love those who show me affection, or submit to punishment when I feel it is deserved. Then Helen says, heathens and savage tribes hold that doctrine, but Christians and civilized nations disown it. And Jane says, how? I don't understand. Helen says, it is not violence that best overcomes hate, nor vengeance that most certainly heals injury. What then? Jane asks. And Helen says, read the New Testament and observe what Christ says and how he acts. Make his word your rule and his conduct your example. What does he say? She asks. Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and despitefully use you. And in a way, this is kind of coming from the Sermon on the Mount, which really, most of the Sermon on the Mount is actually just the law. Like, it's a much more fleshed out version of the law, but if you take it by itself, it's just giving you more commands. Okay, now, not only do you have to, like, be marginally polite to your enemies, you have to love them, But the way Helen is presenting it, you can tell that she's saying we do this because of what Christ has done for us, because of how Christ is completely changing our paradigm. He's taking people who are our enemies, and now they're our neighbors who we have to love because of what he's done on the cross. She's not saying all that because this is a novel and not a theological book, but I think you can definitely see that coming through. And then later on, Jane comes in to see Helen when she's dying, and Helen says, I am very happy, Jane, and when you hear that I am dead, you must be sure and not grieve. There is nothing to grieve about. We must all die one day, and the illness which is removing me is not painful. It is gentle and gradual. My mind is at rest. I leave no one to regret me much. I have only a father, and he is lately married and will not miss me. By dying young, I shall escape great sufferings, which, just as an aside, is very true given that she's at Mr. Brocklehurst's school. She says, I had not qualities or talents to make my way very well in the world. I should have been continually at fault. And Jane asks, but where are you going to, Helen? Can you see? Do you know? And Helen says, I believe, I have faith, I am going to God. And Jane asks, where is God? What is God? Helen says, my maker and yours, who will never destroy what he created. I rely implicitly on his power, confide wholly in his goodness. I count the hours till that eventful one arrives, which shall restore me to him, reveal him to me. And as I'm reading that, I'm like, wow, this is like, just hitting us with biblical truth. It's kind of hard to believe that a 10-year-old would be waxing eloquently like this on her deathbed as she's dying from tuberculosis. But, it works in the novel. And
Mhm.
this is the first time that anyone in Jane's life has presented something like the gospel to her. Even though she's growing up in a nominally Christian country, the people with whom she's been spending most of her time and the Christianity, quote unquote, with which she's been presented has all been the law. She hasn't been getting this. I mean, she's even asking, like, where do you go when you die? She doesn't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And that just shows that the fact that Jane is operating by the law early on is really more from ignorance than anything, because she's just never been
Sure.
presented with anything else. And our natural instinct is to assume, well, people are judging us by the law, so that must be the way we should judge everyone
Right.
else.
Right.
So you see that contrast in her
Yeah, that's
early
beautiful.
life.
I think too, to go back to the way Helen is kind of presenting the gospel, like that last portion you just read is the promise, right? And I think from there if we can work kind of backwards, that is obviously where she gains her identity. And by that, she can then say things like, well, as a Christian, you don't need to hate your neighbor. You love your neighbor. Like these are the things that come out of this. And so it is this total reversal of do this so that you get this, you do A, B, and C, follow these rules, be, clean and good, well behaved and meek as a child or whatever in order to earn this reward. Or I think in probably Mr. Brocklehurst's case, it's like, well, I'm going to teach these girls a certain way of life. So either they get something out of it or I get something out of it, whether there's like power or money involved in that equation for him, versus Helen, who's like, no, I trust this promise. I've been given this promise. I am this. And so therefore, why would I act any different?
Yeah. So then when Jane goes to Mr. Rochester's fancy estate, he is obviously a sinner from the first time she meets him. Not in that he's like a murderer or anything, but though we don't immediately receive all the details of his backstory, it's clear he's been off wandering, going all over the world with his money. It's heavily implied he's been sleeping with a lot of women. And he shows up, he's very, very clearly like feeling a hollowness within himself. And not only do other people judge him to be a sinner, but he feels that he himself is a sinner. Here's what he says to Jade when they first meet.
Yeah.
He says, "No, young lady, I am not a general philanthropist. I bear a conscience," and he pointed to the prominences which are said to indicate that faculty. "And besides, I once had a kind of rude tenderness of heart when I was as old as you. I was a feeling fellow enough, partial to the unfledged, unfostered, and unlucky. But fortune has knocked me about since. She has even kneaded me with her knuckles, and now I flatter myself I am hard and tough as an India rubber ball, pervious though through a chink or two still, and with one sentient point in the middle of the lump." Then he asks, "Does that leave hope for me?" And you see there, it's interesting because he admits that his heart is hardened, that he's not really being a charitable person, but yet he kind of blames it on fortune. He doesn't really say,
yes.
it's not
Yeah.
repentance. He just said,
Yeah.
he does ask, is there some hope for me? You see there's some little part of him that like remembers something from long ago that he could have been different. And you do find out as the book goes on that he had kind of a difficult childhood. He was the spare, not the heir. So he kind of pulled a Prince Harry and he was going everywhere looking for love. This has gotten him into bad situations. So obviously there are circumstances that have helped make him this way. But we see that he's kind of trying to act as if he had no free will at all in the matter.
Right.
We know that people, absent Christ, we don't have complete free will. But in this case, what he means by not having free will is, well, I'm not really a sinner that much because basically the devil made me do it kind of situation.
Yeah. Well, and almost
So,
like I'm a victim. I'm a victim to sin and I have no say in the matter. It's almost like a little bit of a victimhood mentality. Yeah.
Yeah. And Jane asked the question whether he was capable of being retransformed. That's what her internal monologue is saying at that time. And she does think him very prickly and unlikable at the beginning, but as they go on, and he starts to kind of soften around her.
Mm-hmm.
And later on in the book, she asks, and was Mr. Rochester now ugly in my eyes? No, reader. She does break the fourth wall and refer to the reader a lot. She says, gratitude and many associations, all pleasurable and genial, made his face the object I best liked to see. His presence in a room was more cheering than the brightest fire. Yet I had not forgotten his faults. Indeed, I could not, for he brought them frequently before me. He was proud, sardonic, harsh to inferiority of every description. In my secret soul, I knew that his great kindness to me was balanced by unjust severity to many others. Yet, nevertheless, she says, I believed he was naturally a man of better tendencies, higher principles, and purer tastes than such as circumstances had developed, education instilled, or destiny encouraged. Basically, what's happening here is she's starting to see him through the lens of the gospel in a way. She's seeing this potential that's there. Like, basically, yes, he's done these bad things, but he could be different. So she's not just saying, oh, well, he's a sinner, I'm just going to write him off. She's starting to look at, the potential that's there. And I think one thing about Christian love, which is really central to how we understand the gospel and God's love for us, 1 Corinthians 13 says that love hopes all things. Now, that doesn't mean naively thinking, oh, everything will just get better after I marry them or something like that.
Sure.
But there is that kind of openness that the gospel gives us to the possibility that other people could be redeemed. And that's what you're starting to see a little bit with Jane. However, by the time that he asks her to marry him, she's like, punch drunk with love, and that this person is now validating her. And what you see is that although Jane always has a very strong moral code, in her heart she hasn't really 100% gotten the gospel either, because she is looking now to Mr. Rochester for her identity. And she's going to say here, my future husband was becoming to me my whole world, and more than the world, almost my hope of heaven. He stood between me and every thought of religion, as an eclipse intervenes between man and the broad sun. I could not in those days see God for his creature, of whom I had made an idol. So,
wow.
We see there, these are complicated people. They'll have a moment where they'll sort of start to get it, and then they're not. But in general, her relationship with Mr. Rochester has this possibility to open her up to understanding the gospel better and to showing that kind of grace to him. But in her flesh, she's still, she also is looking for validation and love that she hasn't received.
Yeah.
And she's putting that in him. So then the crisis, the turning point of the book comes, and we find out that he's married, he's got this crazy wife, and we see that Jane definitely does have a moral compass, and that she chooses not to remain with him. And he asked her, who would know, who would care? You don't have any family. Who cares if people think that you're a rotten sinner? And she says, I would know. Basically, I would know and God would know. So that you see that she has this understanding of God's commandments. Sometimes when people experience extreme legalism in childhood, they react completely against that and say, well, I'm just going to live a completely libertine existence because there are no rules and I can just do whatever I want. Jane never feels that way. It's like she doesn't completely dismiss Christianity. She's starting to see through to a more true biblical version of Christianity. She's just kind of seeing it in stages throughout her life. So then she's going to encounter the figure of Sinjin Rivers, who I mentioned is also representative of the law. And we have here a description of one of Sinjin's, that's so hard to say, Sinjin's sermons. She says, it began calm, and indeed, as far as delivery and pitch of voice went, it was calm to the end. An earnestly felt yet strictly restrained zeal breathed soon in the distinct accents and prompted the nervous language. This grew to force, compressed, condensed, controlled. The heart was thrilled, the mind astonished by the power of the preacher. Neither were softened, though, she says. Throughout there was a strange bitterness, an absence of consolatory gentleness, stern allusions to Calvinistic doctrines. Election, predestination, reprobation were frequent. And each reference to these points sounded like a sentence pronounced for doom. So we're back to the puritanical thing, right? To this,
Yeah.
not just now pietistic, but this way of viewing election that's only like a damning way of viewing election. In other words, like, you're going to be damned to hell. And that we know that the way we understand election and predestination is very important because it affects how we view God. And it feels like Sinjin, he knows that the Bible preaches about this, so he's preaching it to the people, but he's not connecting it with the gospel. He's not presenting it as, this is God graciously choosing to save you, to act, completely by his power and not yours. He's presenting it as, you better shape up, or you're clearly not one of the elect, and we know that's a very problematic way to present election. And later on, after he asks her to marry him, and she says no, she says, "Good night, Sinjin." And he replies, "Good night, Jane." And she offers, let's shake hands. And this is how she describes his handshake. "What a cold, loose touch he impressed on my fingers. He was deeply displeased by what had occurred that day. Cordiality would not warm nor tears move him. No happy reconciliation was to be had with him. No cheering smile or generous word. But still the Christian was patient and placid. And when I asked him if he forgave me, he answered that he was not in the habit of cherishing the remembrance of vexation, that he had nothing to forgive, not having been offended. And with that answer he left me, I would much rather he had knocked me down."
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So you see, he's being very hypocritical, and we do see in other areas that I won't get into that this character is Sinjin. He's like holding his feelings in.
Yeah.
And
She's not being honest.
Yes. He's presenting this very pious face to the world, but actually he's really struggling inside with this like feeling. There's this other woman that before he proposes to Jane, there was this other woman he really was in love with, but he thought she was not proper as a missionary's wife. So he suppresses that and ignores it and says, "Oh, well, I'm not really in love with her." He tries to pretend. And this is part of why, Jane ultimately decides she has to get away, and she decides to go look and see whatever happened to Mr. Rochester, because she's actually been gone a year or two at this point. And when she finds him, he's now injured. And this is really interesting because when Jane initially comes to him, she's the one that's hard done by. She's the one who's highly inferior.
Yeah.
She's the one who everyone has been saying is a terrible sinner. But now at this point, Mr. Rochester's sins have been fully revealed to the world. It's become like a public knowledge about that he was keeping this wife in. And really, some people say that Mr. Rochester is a really cruel character. And I think there are things he does that are cruel, but I think he really thought he was doing the best thing for his insane wife, because he says that the alternative was to send her to an asylum where she would have really been treated badly. He thought by having her taken care of in her own home that he was really doing the best thing by her. But now he's completely covered with scandal because his house burned down. He's lost everything. He doesn't have nearly the money he did before. Now it's Jane who's rich and in the position to be giving to him. And before he wouldn't take anything.
What's interesting is there's a little bit of parallel between Sinjin's suppression of his own sin, his own or sin and suffering and just emotional state, which I don't want to claim as all sin, but he is obviously suppressing that. And then you see that also in Mr. Rochester, in this suppression of the truth about his life and these decisions he's made, also the decisions that have been foisted upon him. Like they're both hiding that, and then we see what happens. I'll let you continue when obviously that's all exposed for Mr. Rochester and he has to come face to face with it.
So basically through the experiences they've had, both Jane and Mr. Rochester have hit rock bottom. They've now seen there's nothing I can do to make myself, liked by society or righteous before God. There's nothing, and I can't pretend that I don't need anybody else. I am dependent on other people. I'm dependent on God for everything I have. And you see that they really come to a place where they're not making an idol of each other anymore. They are viewing their relationship more properly in relationship to God. And Jane tells him, after she accepts his second proposal, she says, I love you better now when I can be really useful to you than I did in your state of proud independence when you disdained every part but that of the giver and protector. And Mr. Rochester says, hitherto I have hated to be helped, to be led. Henceforth I feel I shall hate it no more. I did not like to put my hand into a hireling's, but it is pleasant to feel it circled by Jane's little fingers. I preferred utter loneliness to the constant attendance of servants, but Jane's soft ministry will be a perpetual joy. And then he says in the next page, he says, Jane, you think me, I dare say, an irreligious dog, but my heart swells with gratitude to the beneficent God of this earth just now. He sees not as man sees, but far clearer, judges not as man judges, but far more wisely. I did wrong. I would have sullied my innocent flower, breathed guilt on its purity. The omnipotent snatched it from me. I, in my stiff-necked rebellion, almost cursed the dispensation. Instead of bending to the decree, I defied it. Divine justice pursued its course. Disasters came thick on me. I was forced to pass through the valley of the shadow of death. His chastisements are mighty, and one smote me which has humbled me forever. He means there that he's blind now. He says, I was proud of my strength, but what is it now when I must give it over to foreign guidance as a child does its weakness? Of late, Jane, only of late, I began to see and acknowledge the hand of God in my doom. I began to experience remorse, repentance, the wish for reconcilement to my Maker. I began sometimes to pray. Very brief prayers they were, but very sincere. And we see really that he comes to a place of repentance, and that allows them. Now, you see that basically God didn't want them to get married the wrong way in what would have really been a bigamous marriage and not a marriage at all. But beyond that, idolizing each other. And now they're able to come to marriage with both of them having a much better understanding of the gospel and viewing each other through the lens of grace. So for me, that is really what the book is about. And because that's such a theological theme, a lot of literary critics are not going to be looking at that quite as much. But I think from what I've read, it's very obvious that that's what the author was trying to put in there. This distinction between law and gospel, and taking our two very flawed lead characters, Jane and Mr. Rochester, through basically taking them into the pit of hell so that they can be then resurrected.
And ironically, he's physically blind, and yet his eyes are open. Both of their eyes are opened, I think, to the true nature of humanity, which, is brought by the law, but then also because of that, their eyes are open to the need for the gospel, for God and his promises, which is an interesting twist that she did there.
Yeah. So that's the end. That's Jane Eyre. And as she says, the very famous first line of the last chapter, reader, I married him. And that's all she wrote. And they do end up having one or more children. I don't remember exactly, but sometime around the time of the birth of their first child, Mr. Rochester gains a little bit of sight in one eye. So, and that's kind of, I think, supposed to be a sign of a divine grace. And so it's a very good book. I would encourage you all to read it, or if you don't have time to read the whole book, catch one of the many film adaptations.
Well, that was amazing. Also, I think you need to start a YouTube channel where you just read books with the character voices, because
don't
that was
tempt
great.
me, Kelsi. They're putting out an audiobook of Broken Bonds and Face to Face, and they wisely have had someone else read it, which is a very good decision. So look for that.
Well, I enjoyed
but if you want to hear me read, you'll have to tune into the Outside Ourselves podcast.
Thanks so much, Amy. This is great, and I'm excited for people to listen. Appreciate it. Outside Ourselves is a 1517 podcast and show. To learn more about all of our podcasts and all of our shows, please go to 1517.org/podcast. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back here in a couple weeks with our next guest for the summer break series.